Hey everybody, welcome back to Planet Coaster, and welcome back to Apex, the Intamin inverted coaster. In this episode, I'm working on the station and some of the surrounding theming and scenery, and I'm going to use the word theming very lightly because you'll discover later in this video what the theming of this coaster is going to be. But for now, I'm mostly going to work on the environment because that's going to be a bit of an experiment as well. So without further ado, let's get started. So for the surroundings of this coaster, I wanted to try some things that I haven't done before with exclusively ThemeMaker's Toolkit items to get a different look in the game than I'm used to at least, or that some of you guys might be used to as well. And this kind of comes back to something that I like to talk about more often recently, which is the fact that after 8 years of Planet Coaster, many builds have started looking the same. You know, you can only look at the same tree and the same plank pieces for so many times until you start recognizing everything and things just start looking very similar. And I think the ThemeMaker's Toolkit items are perfect for adding that different flair into builds to make them more distinguishable from each other. And my experiment here was to see how I could use the ThemeMaker's Toolkit items to make a sort of natural environment that feels a bit different from most Planet Coaster builds. Because I'm not going to theme this coaster quite as densely as Terran, for instance. The inspiration here is more something like Nemesis, where you're going through rocks and you have these cliff faces and lots of shrubbery around the coaster, but still give you something interesting to look at and also try to keep the coaster as close to the ground as possible at all times, because that really increases the sensation of speed. I think especially with terrain inverted coasters like this, having your feet dangle just a meter or so from the ground at all times while you're going through these elements very quickly is something that really adds to the sensation of thrill. And because of that, I also wanted to see how I could make this environment look a bit more unique in Planet Coaster standards. And by that I don't mean entirely unique, because these are definitely pieces that other people have played with before. Not sure in this kind of context too. But anyway, my main three things that I'm working with are firstly the rubble pieces by Hydro, which is the stuff that I'm putting right underneath the track. And as you can see, I did some off-camera work as well. It is what it is. There is no way that I'm going to be able to add these rubble pieces and grass pieces and rockwork alongside every part of the track and also film all of it, or we would have 3 episodes of me just doing that stuff. But at least I figured, I'd give you a taste of what it looks like to build these things. So we have the rubble pieces right underneath the coaster track, which really looks like gravel. I think I can imagine it's the kind of thing that, as a construction company you put into these trenches. Maybe also to make sure that you don't have weeds growing everywhere, because with roller coasters like this, you always have to make sure that you trim all of your greenery and shrubbery and trees all around the coaster at all times to make sure you don't chop anyone's feet off. And in this case, I think putting this layer of gravel right underneath the track, it looks pretty cool, but it's probably also pretty practical. Not entirely sure about that, and also you can see the grass peeking through at many points. I used some grass pieces, which I don't remember who they're by. I might actually look that up in while I'm talking. But anyway, I think ThemeMaker's Toolkit grass is something that I haven't really played with enough in this game. I've always avoided it because it tends to look a little bit unrealistic. It doesn't move. Sometimes it reflects kind of strangely the light, which is something that happens with ThemeMaker's Toolkit foliage items in general. It's really difficult to get the lighting right. So most of the grass pieces that people have made and put on the workshop also either look, strange from certain angles, or the light starts reflecting on it in certain ways. In any case, it doesn't really come close to the realism of the grass that we have in Planet Zoo, for instance. But with this coaster, I think the thing that helps is that when you're on the coaster, doing the POV, you can always only see the grass from a particular angle, so you can make sure that whenever you place the grass, you place it in such an angle that from the coaster POV's perspective, it'll look fine. And then everything is also in these trenches, so it means that from off-ride shots and from footpaths and stuff like that, You won't be able to notice the grass that much anyway, so I think it's a good way to make use of it and make this build look a little bit more realistic and different, but at the same time kind of overcome some of the shortcomings that Theme Maker's Toolkit items have sometimes. Also, I looked up in the meantime the grass is made by DNR, and the Rockwork pieces that I'm using are made by Mango, who has been killing it for years now on the workshop, uploading loads of very specific themed items, and he has huge sets of rocks on the workshop, which are non-recolorable but great textures I think in certain cases, and there's a particular rock set which I'm using for this build. I think the only slight downside, at least for what I'm trying to achieve here of the rock pack, is that they are pretty small in size, which is good for detailing, but it can take some effort to build rock faces as large as I'm doing for this ride. But I'll try to come up with some tricks for that in a minute or so, so you'll see how I build some larger rock faces. But for now, my basic way of approaching this was to put the gravel right underneath the tracks and then put the grass next to that. Also, I put some different foliage and shrubbery items from the Theme Maker's Toolkit in, well, sections here and there in the grass, just to give it a bit of texture and make it look like there are some small weeds growing in there as well. And then my third step was to put the Rockwork pieces on the cliff faces that I had on the side of the coaster, because my terrain editing here is pretty basic and bare bones. I really didn't want to use the in-game terrain rockwork and just create cliff faces that I could put the scenery rockwork up to make it look a bit different as well. And I think altogether these pieces work pretty nicely, especially because the grass is recolorable, so you can adjust it to something that works with the rockwork. And then the rubble pieces are also recolorable, so love it when pieces are flexible like that and you can just infinitely, come up with different variations. Now this is where I wanted to add some bigger rockwork. So eventually I figured the only way that I can do this is probably try to make my own rockwork pieces out of these smaller pieces. So that's what I ended up doing here. I wanted to go for a large structure of rocks that would jut out from the ground and kind of look like they're put in place as a sort of... This is a very strange metaphor, but I don't know if the game Mikado is well known outside of the... Oh yeah, it is. That is a pretty well known game. Anyway, with that game you usually have these wooden sticks and you have to fish out a wooden stick without touching any other ones. And I don't know why my brain came up with this comparison, but it's just kind of like how I felt I wanted these rocks to look like, except more vertically, having sort of sticks of rockwork move in all kinds of slightly different directions, as if it were an arranged Mikado game. Also, my inspiration for this rockwork is a particular painting by Caspar David Friedrich, which sounds super pretentious, but honestly, there is some amazing looking rockwork in some paintings, and especially Caspar David Friedrich has loads of kind of natural elements where the whole point of the painting is kind of, being in awe of the shapes and composition of nature. Maybe that's not the point, obviously that's an interpretation, but it's the appeal at least. And he has this particular painting called Sea of Ice, which is pretty well known, which is really just a composition of ice, and yeah, that's it, somewhere in the North Sea, or in the North Pole I guess, with a shipwreck somewhere. And it's just a really cool painting with awesome composition, which was for me the inspiration to put my rockwork like this, kind of similar to how it's done in that painting, which I think is a cool inspiration. It might very well take more inspiration from paintings for rockwork, because it is a sort of supernatural thing in the same sense. Obviously these rocks aren't entirely natural, and I'm trying to go for something that looks epic as opposed to, just being a natural representation of real life rockwork, which I guess is also typical for theme park rockwork in general. It's often inspired by real life locations, but always trying to make it seem a bit more cinematic and play with the composition a bit as opposed to what you'd find just in nature. Although there are probably some places where you would find rocks like this. I'm already thinking of what I believe is called Bohemian Switzerland, close to Dresden, which is an area with beautiful hills and interesting rock facades, which is definitely worth checking out if you're ever in the area, just in case. Anyway, that's it for the first part of this video. Let's get to building a footbridge and see how that finishes up this valley. So, at some point I had the assignment of backwards engineering myself a queue line to go through this area of the coaster. And one of the final results of that is this footbridge over here, which crosses the valley that the coaster goes through and we have the two launches in. And I imagine would give a really cool view of this. I've always been a really big fan of the queue line of Terran, at least the queue line without the extension queue, that is. And there's a part of the queue line in Terran where you cross the tracks and you look straight over the launch track. And it's always for me something where I just pause for a second, hold up the queue and take some pictures whenever a train is passing by. But it's also just a really cool view and something I wanted to try in this build as well. And on the other sides of this queue we just have some simple cattle pens and back and forths. Not quite as interesting I think as this bridge, but the idea that you're walking through the area that the coaster is moving through and you have these unique sight lines of the coaster doing its thing, I think is pretty important in queue lines whenever you can do it. And really you don't need to theme your queue line if you just make sure you can see the coaster from the queue line. So that's the deal here. Other than that, it's not too special. I'm making this out of custom concrete pieces in very similar colors to the Rockwork because I want the architecture to blend into the environment as much as possible. So not drawing too much attention to it and mostly using the same colors and keeping it pretty light but sort of modern, futuristic at the same time. And yeah, I just thought it was worth showing off as its separate own little chapter here. But now it's time to move on to the big highlight of the show today. So, the station. I'm actually going to tease you for a little bit longer because I'm first going to work on what's underneath the station. We're going to have to build this up layer by layer, and this is the bottom layer, so realistically I wanted to finish this first before I went into how I was going to build the station. Now, these are going to be the two trenches that the launches go through. Again, very similar to Terran. I'm a really big fan of how it goes through these trenches and how tight and compact they are. And having all of those vertical and horizontal beams around you also greatly increases the sense of speed as you're going through these launches. So that's something that I wanted to copy here as well. So some of this is sort of pointless. You know, partly this tunnel is what the station is built on. But it's also extending a little bit on the size of the station as well, just alongside the entire launch track. And again, using mostly concrete pieces here, some of them from the Theme Maker's Toolkit, some of them in-game, just depending on what kind of pieces I needed. But mostly following the same colors as the Rockwork and trying to blend in as much as possible with the environment. Keeping it pretty simple that way as well. My inspiration for this was also kind of brutalist architecture, which was actually the starting point for me for this station in general. Eventually I let go of that idea, but I think it still has a little bit of an air of brutalism. Anyway, there was something that I didn't record there because it was a bit annoying to record it, and it would result in probably an annoying time-lapse to watch, but I placed lights alongside the entire base of the trenches there. And also some extra decorative elements, but that took a lot of moving the camera around in tight spaces, so not too great for time lapses. Sometimes I also cut that sort of stuff out for practical reasons. Anyway, now we get to the fun bit of the station building, and to my theme, if there ever was anything. So, like I just said, my original idea for this was to do something brutalist related, and this was originally inspired by Le Havre in France, which I visited a couple of weeks ago. The city has this beautiful concrete cathedral in the middle of the city center, which is because the city was gravely damaged in World War II and then rebuilt in a completely modern style, Not brutalist per se, if you want to follow the strict definition that architectural nerds like to follow, but very similar. And the church especially, I think, is really interesting. And I remember dragging my family to this concrete church and then being kind of skeptical, like, what are we doing here? But I think it's a really beautiful building, especially once you enter it. It doesn't look too special from the outside, but in the inside, it's one of the most futuristic-looking sci-fi Blade Runner-esque buildings I've ever seen. It has beautifully designed stained glass windows as well, which the colors, the sun falls through and it enters the inside of this enormous building. Looks super cool, and really no description can do this building justice. Pictures really can't either, you just have to visit it. But if you want to have an idea of what I'm talking about, you can Google the Cathedral of Le Havre on Google Images, I suppose, and at least get a bit of a clue. But yeah, that was my original inspiration. But then it just didn't really work out for a station building. So here's my second attempt. Not quite brutalism, but still something that, in my eyes at least, is somewhat adjacent. This station building is just is just me trying to turn the painting, The Sea of Ice, into a building. I was just looking at the painting, looking at the composition, and seeing all of these triangle shapes mostly together, and thinking of a way to turn this three-dimensional. Now, it's something which actually I think worked out a little bit better than I expected, and I don't really like copying things normally, but in this case it felt very different because I was trying to take over the basic composition but turn it into a building. And it's also something that I imagine is actually pretty cheap and simple to build, at least from a realism standpoint, because this station is really just a box, a concrete box, super simple. And then all of these triangles are concrete elements that are flat, that stick out in different directions. And just to give the building some depth and also hide the square structure of the building, which I'm mostly happy with, actually worked out, because I am always very much against building square buildings. It's just very hard to make them look interesting and dynamic and make them fit into an environment, especially if we have something like this, a lot of nature and rockwork and interesting terrain around it. But in this case, I think all of the triangular elements really help to hide that shape and also really make it feel like the painting came to life a little bit. And it's also fun in terms of the detailing, because, building this, I was just looking at the building from different angles and thinking, where can I add an extra triangular element? So it was just pretty chill to build this. It's made out of simple pieces as well, not too much scrolling. But also, it's fun to play with the textures of these walls, because most of this is just simple concrete walls. Some of them, again, ThemeMaker's Toolkit, some of them in-game. But I think the finishing touch is actually in the detailing on different sides. It's a very simple looking building, and I wanted to keep it simple and not add too many textures or different shapes. But adding the decals and the lights, which I'll do in a second, really changed the whole look of the building, I think, and made it work a lot more than I was expecting. When I was building this right here, at this point in the time-lapse, I was still very skeptical of how this was eventually going to work. But then once I added Furana's decals, which I've said it before, but I'll say it again, I think the most important ThemeMaker's Toolkit items, at least for me, that anyone's ever made. They just allow you to change textures and make everything look a bit more gritty and realistic. But as soon as I added these, there was this sort of moment for me when it clicked, which is always really fun. Recently, somebody asked me what I think is the most fun part of doing these Planet Coaster builds. And for me, I think it's the moment when things just click. And it could be in a particular building, it could be a particular build in general, or roller coaster layout. But usually I start off very skeptical of my own builds, and I have to push through myself thinking, this looks horrible. This is never going to be good. Until at some point you just finish it well enough, or you add certain elements where it starts to look decent. And I suddenly gain some sort of confidence in what I'm doing, and I'm like, okay, maybe this isn't so bad after all. And for me, adding the decals to this building was that moment where I'm like, oh, this might actually work out. So always the most fun moment, I think, of doing builds like this. At that point, it's just riding the build to the finish and making sure everything is done. But it's, I think the point, at least to myself, was proven there that this might work out. Now, it was at that point that I thought, we need something in the foreground here. Building, doesn't exist without its context, and I think something that can make a huge impact on how your building looks is how it's placed in the area around it. And for this here, I wanted to have a foreground with rockwork moving in different directions than the triangles of the building, if that makes sense. So the rockwork here is coming out from the middle and going to the sides, and a bit horizontal as well, kind of curving up the farther away it was. And the station building is coming from the middle and going up and to the side, which it doesn't really sound like much, but I was just thinking of this like, these rockwork elements could really frame the building, if you were. So you're walking up to it here, and they're kind of like building the canvas of seeing the building in the distance, which I think it was also a bit like the painting as well. I think the Sea of Ice has a really good sort of foreground-background play, where the foreground has much warmer and darker colors and is going in a different direction than the main elements in the painting. It's just something about the composition of the whole thing is genius. And I know I'm not saying much here because it's one of the most famous paintings in the world. But yeah, it's really cool. And something where I try to at least take some pointers from it in for the coaster here. Plus, it also provides an interesting valley for the coaster to fly through here, because I do think it's fun to have the coaster, right here at the exit path, but in front of the space where you see the first coaster for the first time, and reaching one of its top speeds right in front of your eyes, right below the station. I think that really gives a cool sensation, if you haven't ridden the coaster yet, of just how intense this thing is going to be. And of course we have another bridge here too, which is a little bit like the other one, which I already built. I'm just making the railings smaller on this one. But again, coming back with the grey, everything is kind of grey-scaled in this build, but that felt just right. The same goes for the track color, which I have played with colors like red and yellow and different color schemes for this coaster. But in the end, black just felt the best. There's just something about keeping the colors very simple and letting the shapes do the work, and having the rest of the color variation be in the foliage and the blue sky. And yeah, otherwise pretty simple. That just felt nice. Now, my final touch for this episode, which is also one of those moments where at first I was like, I don't know if this is gonna work, but eventually something clicked, and I think it works pretty nicely, is adding neon strips to all of the elements here. So to the side of the bridge, but also all of the triangles, so that at night the whole composition of this building is still very well visible. But even during the daytime, I think it adds an interesting bit of detail to not just leave these concrete elements that the triangles are made out of completely bare and grey, but having this little accent to them as well. Speaking of triangles, by the way, this is why I decided to call the coaster Apex. I was thinking about a fitting name for a while, and everything just sounded too weird or too generic for a coaster. There are so many names that have been done so many times. I considered things like Vortex, for example. Eventually, I ended up going with Apex because it's also mathematics related. You have the apex of a triangle. So I was like, that's a funny little gag name for you. I think it sounds cool, but it's also a nerdy mathematics joke. You're welcome. Also, one thing I forgot to mention up to now, but I think is worth pointing out, is that my idea for this was always to have a station flyby, just like a tornado in Sarkanimi in Finland. But building the station in such a way that the coaster could fly straight through an entire building and you could see it happen from inside the coaster station itself was just too difficult with how much track is closely built to each other here. So eventually I opted for just having the coaster fly through a section of triangular wall, which I think also works fine enough. It kind of creates the same sort of vibe, so pretty happy with it overall. That said, that's about it for this episode. I'd like to thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye!